The salt air clung to Private Ellis Harper's uniform like a second skin as he crouched in the dim hold of the HMS Vanguard, a battered corvette slicing through the North Atlantic's gray swells. It was 1943, and the convoy they escorted carried vital supplies to Murmansk, fuel, munitions, the lifeblood of the Russian front. Harper, 22 and wiry from years of farm labor back in Devon, fiddled with the valve on a cluster of rice paper envelopes, each the size of a man's torso, filled with hydrogen stolen from the ship's welding tanks. His hands, calloused and steady, betrayed none of the doubt gnawing at him. "This better work," he muttered to himself, the words lost in the groan of the hull against the waves. Sergeant Tom Riley, broad-shouldered and scarred from Dunkirk, leaned against a bulkhead nearby, nursing a cigarette that glowed like a firefly in the shadows. He was the cautious one, always weighing risks against the brass's wild schemes. "Harper, you look like you're building a kite for the village fair, not a weapon." His voice carried the lilt of Belfast, roughened by too many smokes and too few victories. Riley had seen enough failed gadgets, pingers that fizzled, depth charges that sank their own boats, to doubt this latest brainchild from some egghead at Admiralty. But orders were orders, and the U-boats were closing in, their wolf packs turning the sea into a graveyard. Up on deck, Lieutenant Clara Voss, the only woman officer aboard, sharp-eyed and unyielding, scanned the horizon through binoculars. She was German-born, defected in '39 after her family fled the Nazis, and her accent still drew sidelong glances from the crew. Brave didn't begin to cover it. Voss had volunteered for this suicide run, her knowledge of U-boat tactics the convoy's best shield. The wind whipped her cap low, and she tasted the storm brewing, iron and ozone on her tongue. "Contact bearing 240, she called to the bridge, her voice cutting through the spray. Radar had picked up the shadow hours ago, a Type 7 sub, sleek and deadly, lurking just beyond visual range. If it struck, the convoy would scatter like chaff, and Vanguard would be left to hunt alone. Harper sealed the lost balloon, tying it to a harness of fishing line and balsa struts scavenged from the carpenter's shop. The contraption was absurd, fragile paper shells meant to rise on the wind, trailing incendiary charges that could snag a periscope or foul a conning tower. Inspired by whispers of Japanese experiments, but jury-rigged here from ration wrappers and farm ingenuity, he hefted the bundle, light as a dream, and climbed the ladder to the deck. The sea rolled beneath him, whitecaps clawing at the hull. Riley followed, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "If this floats away, we're explaining to the captain why we wasted his gas." Voss turned as they emerged, her face taut under the sodium lamps. "Timing's everything. Launch at dusk. Let the wind carry them east." She didn't smile, but there was a flicker in her eyes, the shared weight of desperation. The crew had dubbed it the Ghost Fleet, these paper phantoms, but no one laughed. Below, the engine thrummed harder, pushing Vanguard toward interception. Harper secured the balloons to the fantail winch, feeling the chill seep into his bones. One wrong gust, and they'd ignite the deck. One miss, and the sub would send them to the bottom. As the sun dipped, painting the waves in bruised purples, the first ping echoed from the sonar dome, a hollow, insistent tone that set teeth on edge. Riley stubbed out his cigarette. "They're diving. Harper now." Harper pulled the release, and the balloons unfurled like sails in a child's toy, rising on invisible currents. They bobbed upward, 6 in all, their paper skins translucent against the fading light, trailing wires that hummed faintly in the breeze. Voss watched them climb, a prayer unspoken on her lips. The sub was out there, invisible hunter in the deep, and these fragile things were their only surprise. The deck vibrated as the corvette turned hard to starboard, guns crews scrambling to battle stations. Harper gripped the rail, heart pounding in rhythm with the screws. Riley stood beside him, silent now, his caution giving way to the raw edge of hope. Far above, the balloons caught an updraft, drifting toward the unseen enemy like messengers from another world. The sea whispered threats below, but for a moment the air felt alive with possibility. Lieutenant Elias Crow wiped the grease from his hands on a rag that was already black with it, staring at the skeletal frame of the balloon in the dim light of the hangar. The Scottish wind howled outside the corrugated metal walls, rattling the loose panels like distant gunfire. It was the third night in a row they'd pushed through, fueled by weak tea and the kind of stubborn hope that came from too many defeats. Elias glanced at his partner, Sergeant Mira Voss, who was hunched over a workbench, her fingers deftly twisting wire around a cluster of incendiary fuses. She was the cautious one, always double-checking the math on the lift calculations, while Elias charged ahead with sketches scribbled on the back of ration wrappers. "These thermite packs are finicky," Mira muttered, not looking up. Her voice carried the flat accent of Manchester, sharpened by exhaustion. "One wrong connection, and we'll have a fire show right here instead of over the North Sea." Elias nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. On the prototype they'd lost last week. The first balloon had ascended beautifully in the test field, its rice paper skin shimmering under the floodlights, buoyant with hydrogen from the jury-rigged tanks. But as it climbed, a gust had caught it wrong, twisting the mooring lines until the whole thing plummeted into the lock, fuses hissing uselessly in the cold water. Commander Hale had chewed them out for an hour afterward, his face red as the cliffs at dawn, but beneath the anger was the unspoken truth. They were running out of time. U-boats were sinking supply ships faster than the Atlantic could churn out replacements, and this mad idea, firebombs delivered by balloon, was their Hail Mary. He stepped closer to the new frame, a lattice of bamboo poles lashed together with silk cord, fragile as a spider's web yet designed to carry a payload that could turn steel to slag. The concept had come from whispers of Japanese experiments, smuggled reports via the OSS, but they'd adapted it for their needs. Clusters of paper envelopes filled with hydrogen released in sequence to propel the thing across the channel like a ghost ship in the sky. No engines, no pilots, just wind and a prayer. "Hand me the altimeter gauge," Elias said, holding out his palm. Mira slid it over without a word, her eyes flicking to the hangar doors where Hale's silhouette paced just beyond the slit of light. The commander had arrived unannounced that evening, his staff car kicking up mud on the rutted track from Inverness. Elias had caught fragments of his conversation with the base engineer. Fuel shortages worsening, another convoy lost off Iceland. The stakes pressed in like the damp air, heavy and unrelenting. As Elias calibrated the gauge, a sharp crack echoed from the far corner. He spun, heart slamming, to see one of the ballast bags rupture, sand spilling across the concrete floor in a slow, whispering cascade. Mira was there in an instant, cursing under her breath as she knelt to salvage what she could. "Sloppy packing," she said, though they both knew it was fatigue. 18-hour shifts blurring the edges of precision. Elias helped her scoop the grains back, his mind racing. They couldn't afford another delay. Hale had promised a live test at dawn, and if this iteration failed like the last, the project might be scrapped for something more conventional, like depth charges that the U-boats were dodging with ease. He straightened, brushing sand from his knees, and caught Mira's gaze. Her dark hair was tied back in a practical knot, but strands had escaped, framing eyes that held a quiet fire. She'd joined the WRNs after her brother went down with HMS Hood, trading factory work for this secretive outpost. Elias respected that steel in her. It kept him grounded when his own impatience threatened to unravel everything. The doors groaned open then, admitting a blast of chill air and Commander Hale himself. He was a broad man in his 50s, uniform crisp despite the mud, his mustache trimmed like a challenge. "Progress?" he barked, eyes scanning the balloon's half-assembled form. "Close, sir," Elias replied, stepping forward. Fuses integrated, lift tested to 5,000 feet. We'll be ready by first light. Hale grunted, circling the structure with the skepticism of a man who'd seen too many gadgets fizzle. This isn't some schoolboy kite, Crow. The Admiralty wants results, not excuses. Those wolf packs are bleeding us dry. Last week alone, 3 tankers gone. If your balloon can slip past their patrols and drop hell on a sub-pens, fine. But if it drifts into Holland instead. He let the threat hang, turning to Mira. Voss, your calculations hold? She met his stare evenly. They do, sir. Wind patterns from the Met Office align with our trajectory. But we need stable release mechanisms. The last one's timer jammed at altitude. Hale's jaw tightened. Then fix it. No more prototypes sinking in the drink. He paused at the door, the wind tugging at his coat. And keep it quiet. If the Jerrys get wind of this, pun intended, we're done. As the doors clanged shut, Elias exhaled, the weight settling back on his shoulders. Mira returned to the fuses, her movements precise but hurried now. They worked in silence for a stretch, the only sounds the snip of cutters and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Elias imagined the balloon aloft, a pale spectre crossing the dark waters, its cargo igniting on some shadowed U-boat deck. But doubt gnawed at him. The hydrogen was volatile, the paper no match for a storm. What if it burst mid-flight, raining fire harmlessly into the sea? By midnight, the frame stood complete, the skin panels draped like translucent sails. Elias inflated the first envelope cautiously, watching the silk billow and strain against its tethers. It held, the hydrogen hissing softly from the valves. Mira attached the final incendiary cluster, a bundle of magnesium flares wrapped in oiled cloth, timed to deploy over targeted coordinates off the Norwegian coast. Test ignition, she asked, holding the striker. Elias hesitated, then nodded. She sparked it on a safe corner. A brilliant white flash bloomed, then steadied into a controlled burn. Heat washed over them, the acrid scent of burning metal filling the air. It worked. For a moment, triumph flickered in his chest. But as the flame died, a low groan came from the main envelope. Elias lunged forward, but it was too late. A seam split under the pressure, hydrogen venting in a sharp whoosh. The balloon sagged, collapsing inward like a Lieutenant Ellis hunched over the workbench in the dim glow of the lantern. His fingers blackened with grease as he twisted the final wire into place. The shed on the outskirts of Portsmouth smelled of damp wood and machine oil, a far cry from the sterile labs he'd imagined for such work. Around him, the balloon's skeletal frame loomed like a forgotten kite, its rice paper skin still folded in neat stacks nearby. Sergeant Hale paced the narrow space, his boots scuffing the concrete floor, while Private Jenkins sat cross-legged, fiddling with a bundle of fuses that looked more like fireworks than weaponry. "It's too flimsy," Hale muttered, stopping to eye the contraption. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who'd seen too many patrols turn sour. "Wind'll tear it apart before it even lifts. And if it does, one gust over the channel, and we're lighting up the sky for every Jerry spotter from here to Brest." Ellis didn't look up, his hands steady despite the knot in his gut. He'd argued this point a dozen times since the orders came down from command. Improvise, they said, with whatever scraps the blackout rations allowed. Paper from ration crates, hydrogen from scavenged welding tanks, a payload of incendiaries cobbled from dud shells. It was madness, born of desperation after the last convoy losses, but madness with teeth if it worked. "Flaws are for fixing, Sergeant, not fretting over." He straightened, wiping his brow, and gestured to the frame. "Test the tension here. Pull." Hale grumbled but complied, yanking the bamboo struts. They held, creaking but unyielding. Jenkins glanced up, his young face pale under the lantern's flicker. "Sir, what if the sub's deeper than we think? That balloon drops the bomb blind. No aiming, no nothing." "Depth charges miss more than they hit," Ellis replied, his tone clipped. He was the thinker, the one who'd sketched this from half-remembered reports of Japanese experiments smuggled through intelligence channels. Hale was the doer, cautious to a fault, always tallying the risks like a quartermaster counting bullets. Jenkins, fresh from training, brought the wide-eyed questions that kept them grounded. 3 men against the U-boat wolf packs that had gutted the Atlantic runs. We time it right, drift it over their patrol lanes at dawn. The incendiary spreads, ignites the fuel vents if they're surfacing. It's not elegant, but it's ours. The door creaked open, letting in a sliver of pre-dawn grey. Corporal Thorne slipped inside, his breath fogging in the chill. He was their fourth, the wiry spotter with eyes like a hawk, assigned after his last crew went down with a freighter. Periscope wake 2 miles offshore, Lieutenant. Moving east, slow. Matches the intel on U-47's sister boat. If we're launching tonight, it's now or never. Tension coiled in the air like the wires under Ellis's hands. They'd planned for a midnight inflation, but the weather reports had soured. Gale warnings from the Met Office. Hale stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. Told you, wind's picking up. We'll lose it over land before it even clears the harbor. Ellis met his gaze, the lantern casting shadows that sharpened Hale's doubt into something sharper. We adapt, reinforce the ballast with those sandbags from the dock. Jenkins, get the hydrogen line prepped. Double-check the valves this time. He turned to Thorne. Signal the boat crew. We launch from the cliff at dusk. If it backfires, we cut the tether and pray. Jenkins scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking over a stack of paper sheets. His hands shook as he uncoiled the hose, the hiss of gas already whispering through the shed. Hale lingered by the frame, his fingers tracing the fragile struts. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of it settling. One balloon, a handful of men, against the steel belly of a sub that could swallow ships whole. Outside, the wind rattled the tin roof, a reminder that plans were just paper until tested. By midday, they wheeled the contraption out under a tarpaulin, the frame bumping over the rutted path to the cliff edge. Portsmouth's sprawl lay behind them, smoke from shipyards curling into the overcast sky. Ellis walked ahead, his mind racing through calculations, lift ratios, drift patterns, the sub's estimated position from Thorne's sketch. Hale pushed the cart, muscles straining against the wind that tugged at the covering like an impatient hand. "This thing's lighter than my kit bag," he said, voice low. "Feels wrong, trusting the sky with our shot." "It's the surprise," Ellis shot back, though doubt gnawed at him too. Command had green-lit it on a whisper. No records, no glory, just results or silence. Jenkins trailed with the fuses, his steps hesitant, while Thorne scouted ahead, binoculars sweeping the horizon. The sea churned below, grey waves flecked with whitecaps, the kind that could shred paper like tissue. They reached the launch point as the sun dipped low, a makeshift platform of crates and ropes hammered together that morning. Unfurling the balloon skin was a delicate dance, Jenkins holding the edges taut, Hale securing the gondola basket where the incendiary nestled like a sleeping dragon. Ellis supervised the inflation, the hydrogen bloating the paper into a pale orb that strained against its tethers. It billowed upward, catching the fading light, a ghost against the darkening cliffs. "Steady!" Thorne called from his vantage, his voice cutting through the gusts. "Subs echo on the wireless, surfacing in 10 minutes, bearing 240. The wind howled then, fiercer, whipping the balloon's tail. A strut groaned, and Jenkins lunged to reinforce it, his face ashen. "It's pulling too hard, sir." Hale braced the ropes, veins standing out on his forearms. "Cut it loose now, or it'll drag us all off the edge." Ellis hesitated, heart pounding. The plan had been flawless on paper. Release at twilight, let the current carry it seaward, detonate over the patrol line. But the gale was rewriting the script, the balloon bucking like a wild horse. He grabbed a knife from his belt, slicing a secondary line to ease the strain. The orb steadied, hovering, its shadow stretching long over the waves. "Now," he said, voice firm. "Release on my mark." The men hauled together, ropes slipping through calloused hands. The balloon rose, wobbling into the sky. A fragile Lieutenant Commander Elias Hart gripped the periscope's handles, his eyes narrowed against the faint glow of the conning tower's red lights. The North Atlantic churned outside, a slate-gray beast under the dim pre-dawn sky, and the U-boat's hull creaked softly with each swell. Below him, in the control room, the hum of the diesels had faded to a whisper. They'd been running silent for hours now, stalking their prey, or what they hoped was prey. "Contact bearing 090, sir," murmured Ensign Riley from the hydrophone station, his voice barely above the drip of condensation from the overhead pipes. Riley was the youngest, all sharp angles and untested nerves, but his ears were gold in these waters. Propellers, multiple blades. German Wolfpack signature, I'd wager. Hart nodded, not trusting words to carry in the tense quiet. He'd seen too many shadows turn to ghosts out here, false echoes that cost fuel and morale. But this felt different. The balloon project, that mad scheme from Admiralty Boffin's back in London, had brought them this far. Paper and hydrogen, they called it. A child's toy turned weapon, meant to drift across the convoy's paths and snag U-boat periscopes or conning towers like a fisherman's net. Explosives hidden in the folds, timed to detonate on impact. Ridiculous on paper, but the tests off Scapa Flow had shown promise. One burst could tear a conning tower open like a tin can. "Surface in 5, Hart said finally, his voice steady as he lowered the periscope. "Prepare to launch." The crew stirred like a waking animal. Chief Engineer Thorne, broad-shouldered and ever the skeptic with his salt and pepper beard, wiped grease from his hands on his overalls. "Balloons again, sir? Last run half of 'em popped before they even caught the wind." Hart shot him a look. Thorne's wit was his armor, but it grated when doubt crept in. "They'll hold this time. Weather's with us. No gale to shred them." Down in the forward torpedo room, converted for the mission, Seaman Kowalski and his mate wrestled the first cluster into position. The balloons were folded like oversized kites, their rice paper skins translucent under the work lights, filled with compressed hydrogen from jury-rigged tanks. Each carried a payload, 20 pounds of amatol, wired to a simple barometric fuse. "Launch them from the deck. Let the current carry them toward the convoy lanes where the wolves hunted, if even one snagged a sub on the surface." The boat broke the waves with a shudder, spray cascading over the bridge. Hart climbed out, the cold air biting through his greatcoat. The sea smelled of salt and diesel exhaust, a familiar sting. Riley followed, clutching the release mechanism, a makeshift catapult rigged from spare periscope parts. Thorne stayed below, monitoring the ballast tanks, his grumbles echoing up the hatch. "Wind's light, sir," Riley said, squinting into the murk. He unfurled the first balloon, its envelope crackling softly as it inflated. The thing rose sluggishly, a pale ghost against the horizon, tethered to a float that bobbed with weighted charges. 3 more followed, each nudged into the current by careful prods from boat hooks. Hart watched them drift eastward, toward the reported Wolfpack coordinates. The plan was sound. The balloons would mimic debris from a sinking merchantman, luring the Germans in for a closer look. Snag one, and the sub's deck would erupt in fire and steel. No torpedoes expended, no direct engagement. Clever, if it worked. But the sea had its own ideas. A rogue gust whipped up from the southwest, stronger than the forecasts promised. The lead balloon twisted, its tether snapping with a sharp twang. It soared erratically, then dipped, the float slamming into a wave crest. Hart's heart sank as the barometric fuse, sensitive to altitude changes, triggered prematurely. A muffled boom echoed across the water, the explosion blooming like a brief flower of orange flame. Shrapnel peppered the sea, but the balloon itself shredded, fragments raining down harmlessly. "Damn it," Hart muttered, grabbing the binoculars. The others held steady for now, but the wind was building, pushing them off course. Riley's face paled in the glass's reflection. "Keep at it, Ensign. Release the rest." They launched the remaining two in quick succession, but the current fought back. One tangled in the boat's own rigging, forcing Kowalski to hack it free with a knife, cursing in Polish under his breath. The last one caught a favorable eddy and sailed true, vanishing into the haze. Below, Thorne's voice crackled over the intercom. "Sir, hydrophone's picking up something. Fast screws closing from the east. They're on to us, or the convoy." Hart's mind raced. The wolf pack. If the balloons had drifted wide, they might alert the Germans instead of ensnaring them. He scanned the horizon, spotting a distant plume of smoke. Not theirs. Enemy. "Dive, dive!" he barked, sliding down the hatch. The klaxon wailed as the boat plunged, water roaring over the freeboard. In the control room, Riley strapped in, his hands trembling on the dive wheel. Thorne shot Hart a grim look. "Plan's backfiring already, isn't it?" "Not yet," Hart replied, though doubt gnawed at him. The U-boat leveled at periscope depth, the hull groaning under the pressure. Outside, the balloons were adrift, wild cards in a deadly game. And now, with screws thrumming closer, the hunters might become the hunted. The periscope whirred up again. Hart peered through, the world reduced to a circle of gray. There, silhouettes on the waves, 3 U-boats surfacing in formation, their decks alive with crew. They were searching, probing for the source of that distant blast. One balloon fluttered into view, perilously close to the lead sub's bow. "Come on," Hart whispered, willing it forward. The wind tugged, the paper envelope straining against its load. The Germans on deck pointed, rifles raised, mistaking it for wreckage, perhaps. A shot rang out, puncturing the skin. Hydrogen hissed, but the fuse held. Then, disaster. The sub's forward motion clipped the tether. The float yanked taut, and the balloon plummeted onto the coning tower. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the world outside erupted. A thunderous crack that shook Hart's own boat like the salt spray stung Elias's eyes as he clung to the railing of the battered U-boat deck, the North Atlantic churning like a living beast beneath them. It was the dead of night, the kind where the stars seemed to mock the frailty of men below, and the balloon's fragile form hovered just ahead, tethered by a single cable that groaned under the strain. Hauptmann Keller paced nearby, his boots clanging against the wet metal, muttering calculations under his breath. "Wind's shifting again," he said, voice low, but edged with that familiar bite. "If we don't adjust the payload now, it'll drift useless before dawn." Elias nodded, wiping his face with the sleeve already soaked through. He was the cautious one, always had been since the academy days, double-checking knots and vectors while the others charged ahead. Beside him, Lieutenant Vogel fiddled with the release mechanism, his fingers black with grease, a wry smile cracking his frost-bitten lips. "Adjust? We're flying a child's toy against the waves. If the British spot us first, it'll be our necks, not the balloons." Vogel was the wit, the one who turned grim watches into bearable tales. But tonight, his humor felt forced, strained by the weight of what they'd built in secret docks back in Kiel. The Fugo prototype, or what the engineers had dubbed Papier Flieger in hushed tones, was no ordinary scout. Crafted from rice paper and lightweight balsa, inflated with hydrogen scavenged from raided airships, it carried not bombs but a cluster of incendiary devices, timed to ignite on contact with water or hull. The idea had come from intercepted Allied reports of Japanese experiments, twisted into something desperate for the Kriegsmarine. A submarine killer, silent and unseen, drifting on winds to snare enemy vessels in flames. But out here, with the U-472 rolling in the swells, it felt like madness. Keller stopped pacing and gripped Elias's shoulder. "You see the periscope sweep? That's HMS Vanguard's escort, 2 miles off. If our balloon doesn't draw them in, we're sitting ducks for their depth charges." The Hauptmann's bravery was the glue holding them. He'd volunteered for this trial run, eyes steady even as command whispered of court-martials for unproven tech. Elias felt the pressure of it all, the war's endless grind, friends lost to convoy hunts, the gnawing doubt if this contraption could turn the tide or just add to the graves. They worked in the dim glow of a shielded lantern, Vogel uncoiling the final ballast line while Elias calibrated the altimeter. The balloon bobbed, its surface rippling like silk in the gale, a single lantern inside casting eerie shadows that danced across the waves. One wrong gust, and the hydrogen could ignite prematurely, turning their deck into a pyre. "Steady now," Elias murmured, his hands trembling not from cold, but the stakes. Success meant a weapon to cripple the Allied supply lines. Failure, well, the sea claimed its own without fanfare. A sudden lurch from the sub's dive alarm shattered the rhythm. Alarms blared below decks, and the conning tower hatch flew open. "Enemy contact! Sonar pings! Bearing 270!" shouted the watch officer, face pale in the red emergency lights. Keller cursed, snapping orders. "Dive prep! Cut the tether! Now!" Vogel lunged for the knife, but the cable snagged, whipping like a live wire as the balloon strained against the pull. Elias dove forward, grabbing the line with both hands, boots slipping on the slick deck. The U-boat tilted, waves crashing over the bow, and he glimpsed the balloon surging upward, free but wild, its path veering toward the distant silhouette of the British destroyer. Heart pounding, he yelled over the roar, "It's away, adjusting east!" But the wind betrayed them. The Papierflieger twisted, lanterns flickering as if signaling their position. Below, the engines thrummed to life, the sub slipping under. Keller hauled Elias down the ladder last, sealing the hatch with a clang that echoed like a coffin lid. In the dim control room, dials spun and men braced, the air thick with sweat and fear. Vogel slumped against a bulkhead, wiping blood from a gash on his forehead. Well, that was elegant. Our paper dragons off to dance with the wolves. The sonar operator's voice cut through the tension. "Contact holding. Balloon's shadow on the surface, sir. They're turning toward it." Keller leaned over the plot table, tracing vectors with a grease pencil. Elias watched, breath held as the minutes stretched. The plan had been simple. Release the balloon to mimic a downed aircraft, luring the escorts close enough for the sub to torpedo from ambush. But the backfire, the early release, meant they were blind now, committed without precision. Depth charges rumbled in the distance, the first salvo shaking the hull like thunder. Lights flickered, and a pipe burst overhead, spraying icy water. "Evasive maneuvers," Keller barked, his calm fracturing just a hair. Elias patched the leak with a rag. Mind racing. The balloon was their gamble, a whisper of ingenuity in a war of iron and fire. If it worked, the Vanguard's hull would blaze from within, papers turning to embers on steel. If not... Vogel caught his eye, forcing a grin. "Think our toy's got teeth, or is it just flapping in the breeze?" Elias managed a nod, but inside, the caution twisted into resolve. They'd built it together, 3 men against the abyss, and now it floated alone, carrying their fragile hope into the night. The pings grew louder, the destroyer closing. In the red-lit confines, Keller plotted the intercept, his voice steady. "Torpedoes ready. We strike when they bite." Elias gripped the periscope handles, waiting for his turn to peer into the black, where paper met predator. The war didn't care for heroes or fools. It only tallied the costs, and tonight those costs hung on a thread of silk and string. Hours blurred in the sub's belly, the air turning stale as they ghosted through the depths. A muffled explosion rocked them, distant but real. "What was that?" Vogel whispered, all wit drained. Elias pressed his ear to the hull, feeling the vibrations. The balloon. It had to be. Keller's face hardened in the glow of the chart light. "Surface in 5. If it's chaos up there, we finish it." They ascended slowly, the pressure easing like a held breath released. Breaching the waves, they emerged. The wind howled across the deck of the HMS Vanguard, whipping salt spray into their faces as the destroyer cut through the choppy North Sea. Captain Ellis gripped the railing, his knuckles white against the cold steel, eyes fixed on the horizon where the faint silhouette of the German U-boat lingered like a shadow, refusing to fade. They'd been tracking it for hours, the balloon rig lashed to the aft deck, trembling under each gust. Lieutenant Harper crouched nearby, fiddling with the release mechanism, his fingers numb but steady. "This gale's going to tear her apart before she even lifts," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Sergeant Klein, ever the one to cut the tension, spat over the side. "Better than sitting ducks in a tin can. Remember that last patrol? We lost the corvette to one of their fish. This paper kite's our ticket to even the score." He adjusted the propane burner, its blue flame flickering defiantly against the storm. The balloon itself was a fragile thing, rice paper treated with lacquer, inflated with heated air, carrying a payload of incendiary charges and depth charges, wired to a simple timer. It was Ellis's idea, born from desperate ingenuity after reading about Japanese experiments smuggled through neutral channels. No one in the Admiralty believed it would work against a sub on the prow, but out here, with the war grinding on into its 5th year, belief was a luxury they couldn't afford. A shout from the lookout snapped them alert. "Contact bearing 270, U-boat surfacing, torpedo tubes trained." The deck erupted into controlled chaos. Sailors scrambled to battle stations, the clatter of boots and the whine of the main guns charging filling the air. Ellis barked orders, his voice cutting through the wind like a knife. "Helm, hard to starboard, evasive pattern delta. Harper, get that balloon airborne now, or we're fish food." The destroyer heeled sharply, waves crashing over the bow as they turned to present a narrower profile to the threat. Harper nodded, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. He and Klein wrestled the burner into position, the balloon straining against its tethers, its envelope bulging like a reluctant ghost. "Ignition sequence," Harper called, flipping switches on the makeshift control box. The flame roared higher, and the balloon shuddered upward, inch by inch, fighting the odds' crosswinds. Below, the U-boat's conning tower broke the surface fully, its deck gun swiveling toward them. A plume of water erupted astern as the first shell whistled past, close enough to rattle the rigging. "She's kissing the sky, sir," Klein yelled, grinning through gritted teeth as the tethers slackened. With a final heave, they released it. The balloon ascended in fits and starts, the wind buffeting it eastward toward the sub's position. Ellis watched from the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, willing it to hold course. The payload swung beneath it, a cluster of bombs designed to drop on impact or by timer, piercing the sub's pressure hull if they got lucky. But luck had been in short supply lately. Their last attempt against a wolf pack had ended with 2 destroyers to the bottom and nothing to show for it. The U-boat fired again, the shells slamming into the sea just off the Vanguard's beam, sending a geyser of foam skyward. The ship shuddered from the near miss, but Ellis held steady. "Gunners, return fire. Keep their heads down." The destroyer's 4-inch guns thundered in response, tracers arcing toward the sub like angry hornets. One round struck home, splintering the U-boat's deck plating and drawing a cheer from the crew. Yet the balloon drifted erratically, caught in a downdraft that pushed it off target. Harper cursed under his breath, scanning the sky. "Wind shear's too strong. She's veering north. Won't reach them in time." Klein slapped his shoulder. "Then we adjust. Radio the other ships in the convoy. Have them herd the bastard into her path." Ellis overheard from the wing of the bridge and nodded approval. It was a gamble, divulging their position to draw the sub closer, but the alternative was watching their invention flutter harmlessly away. As the Vanguard zigzagged, engines thrumming at flank speed, the radio crackled with acknowledgments from the escort group. 2 frigates peeled off, their screws churning the water as they moved to flank the U-boat. The sub, sensing the trap, dove hastily, its bow dipping under with a rush of bubbles. But not before the balloon crossed its wake, the timer ticking down relentlessly. Ellis's heart pounded in sync with the seconds. If it detonated too soon, it would be wasted. Too late, and the sub would be gone. A low rumble echoed from the depths, followed by a muffled explosion that vibrated through the hull. Water boiled up around the sub's last known position, debris, bits of metal and oil, spewing to the surface. The crew held their breath, the wind suddenly seeming quieter. Then a plume of black smoke marked the spot, the U-boat's fate sealed by a contraption lighter than the air it rode. But victory came at a cost. As the balloon's remnants drifted out of sight, a final torpedo from the dying sub streaked toward the Vanguard. It grazed the stern, tearing a gash in the propeller shaft before detonating. The ship lurched, alarms blaring, as power flickered. Ellis steadied himself against the console, tasting blood from a split lip where he'd bitten it. "Damage control to the engine room. Harper, Klein, assess the aft deck. We've bloodied them, but we're limping now." Harper limped back from the rail, his cautious nature vindicated by the hit. "Props fouled, sir. We can make port, but it'll be slow going. That balloon, it worked." Klein, wiping grease from his hands, added wryly, "Yeah, but next time, let's build one that doesn't invite return fire." Ellis allowed a grim smile, the weight of the lives saved, and the one ship they'd nearly lost, settling on his shoulders. The war wasn't over, and innovations like this were double-edged, cutting both ways. As the convoy reformed around them, the sea calming to a deceptive peace, he wondered how many more fragile hopes they'd need to send into the sky. The salt-stung wind whipped across the deck of the U-472, carrying the faint, acrid tang of burning rubber from somewhere astern. Hauptmann Erich Voss gripped the railing, his knuckles white against the cold steel as he scanned the horizon through binoculars smeared with spray. The North Atlantic stretched out like a vast, indifferent slate, broken only by the low silhouette of the convoy they'd been shadowing for 2 days. His crew moved with the practiced hush of men who knew one wrong noise could summon depth charges, but tonight unease hung heavier than the fog. Beside him, Lieutenant Karl Becker adjusted his cap against the drizzle, his face gaunt under the dim red glow of the bridge light. Karl had been Eric's shadow since Kiel, the cautious one who double-checked every valve and plotted courses with a precision that bordered on obsession. "The balloon's signal faded an hour ago, Herr Kallio," he murmured, voice low to avoid carrying over the waves. "If it's the Allies' doing, they're playing a long game. We should dive at first light." Eric lowered the binoculars, rubbing the bridge of his nose where fatigue etched deep lines. The balloon, that absurd contraption spotted drifting from the east, little more than rice paper and string, yet rigged with some infernal device that had already claimed 2 patrols. Reports from HQ were frantic. Japanese-inspired, they said, but weaponized by the enemy. One had detonated near U-319, crumpling her conning tower like tin foil. Eric's own sub had evaded the last sighting by sheer luck, but luck was a fickle ally in these waters. "We press on," he replied, his tone steady despite the knot in his gut. "The convoy's Wolfpack target. If we break radio silence, we'll draw every destroyer from here to Iceland." Below decks, the hum of the diesels thrummed through the hull like a heartbeat. In the control room, Matros Fritz Lang hunched over the hydrophone, ear pressed to the cups, his wiry frame tense. Fritz was the joker of the boat, quick with a quip to lighten the endless watches, but now his brow furrowed as faint pings echoed in his ears. "Propellers, sir. Destroyer class, bearing 270. He called up the tube, his voice stripped of its usual lilt. The crew snapped to, gauges flickering in the green-lit gloom. Eric descended the ladder, boots clanging on rungs slick with condensation. The air grew thicker, laced with the sour reek of unwashed bodies and diesel fumes. "Depth," he barked, sliding into the attack periscope well. 200 meters in closing, Carl reported from the chart table, his pencil scratching urgently. The plan had been simple: shadow the convoy, strike at dusk when escorts thinned. But the balloon sightings had forced them surface running, burning fuel they couldn't spare. Now this, Allied hunters, drawn like moths to their exhaust. "Take us down to periscope depth," Eric ordered. The boat tilted as planes bit water, the sea closing over them with a muffled roar. Fritz's hydrophone crackled. "More contacts, 3, no 4. They're fanning out." The periscope whirred up, and Eric pressed his eye to the rubber cup. Through the swirl of bubbles, he glimpsed the convoy's lights winking like distant stars, merchantmen heavy with supplies for the Russian front. But closer, the destroyers proud, their wakes carving white scars. One balloon fragment bobbed in the chop, a tattered red eye staring back. Eric's stomach twisted. Intelligence whispered of firebombs, incendiary payloads that could ignite fuel lines from afar, if one tangled in their props. "Target the lead freighter," he said, voice calm as he read bearings. "Tube 1, ready." Carl hesitated, just a fraction. "Sir, with the escorts that close?" "Now, Lieutenant." Eric's glare silenced him. The torpedo hissed from the tube, a silver arrow vanishing into the deep. Seconds stretched like wire. Then, a distant bloom of fire lit the water, the freighter's silhouette fracturing amid screams of rending metal. Cheers erupted in the control room, Fritz pounding a fist on the panel. But Eric's eyes stayed glued to the scope. The destroyers veered, their screws thrashing as they hunted the ripple. "Dive, dive!" he shouted. The boat plunged, lights flickering as pressure groaned the hull. Depth charges followed, thudding like hammer blows, shaking rivets loose. In the chaos, a new sound pierced Fritz's headphones, a soft, unnatural whir, like silk tearing overhead. "Balloon!" he yelled, ripping off the cups. "It's right above us, drifting low." Eric's mind raced. The paper devil, silent until it struck. Carl lunged for the ballast controls, but a shudder ran through the boat as something snagged the stern planes. Alarms wailed, the deck tilted sharply. "Emergency blow," Eric commanded, grabbing the voice tube. Water surged, propelling them upward, but the drag held. In the engine room, shouts echoed. "Lines fouled! Cutting torches!" The first depth charge bracketed them, close enough to rattle. Teeth. Eric braced against the bulkhead, tasting blood from a split lip. Carl met his gaze, eyes wide but resolute. "We fight it," Eric said simply, no room for doubt. "Clear the propellers. Fritz, keep those hunters off our tail." As the sub broke surface in a froth of foam, the balloon loomed, a fragile ghost against the stars, its payload swinging like a pendulum. Gunfire cracked from the deck crew, tracers stitching the night. One bullet shredded the paper skin. A spark leaped and the world ignited. Flames licked the sea, hot and voracious, as the balloon's guts spilled fire across the waves. Eric shielded his face, barking orders through the inferno's roar. The sub lurched free, scorched but whole as the destroyers closed in. But in that moment, amid the acrid smoke, a grim certainty settled. The war's ingenuity had claimed another piece of them, and the cost was etched in every singed face. The salt spray stung Elias's eyes as he clung to the railing of the HMS Vanguard, the destroyer's deck pitching wildly under the storm's assault. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the churning sea like a battlefield scarred by artillery. Below in the engine room, Harlan's voice barked orders over the roar of the diesels, his wiry frame silhouetted against the glowing gauges. "Keep her steady, lads. We're not losing this bastard now." Elias nodded to himself, gripping the binoculars tighter. The U-boat's conning tower had vanished into the waves minutes ago, but the sonar pinged relentlessly, a ghost refusing to die. Jensen, the young, able seaman with the perpetual squint from too many North Atlantic watches, pressed against Elias's side, his breath ragged. "Sir, you think the balloon held? That contraption of paper and string against a wolf pack?" Elias clapped a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tremor there. Brave kid, but green. He'd lost his first shipmate to a depth charge ripple last month. "It held, Jensen. Harlan's mad invention or not, it's our edge." The balloon, Harlan's desperate brainstorm, a cluster of lightweight rice paper orbs filled with helium scavenged from weather stations, tethered to a cluster of magnetic mines. No one in Naval Command had approved it. Too flimsy, they said, like kites against Krupp steel. But with the sub's torpedoes expended and their own ammo running low, it was launch or surrender. The plan had backfired spectacularly an hour earlier. They'd released the balloons from the fantail under cover of darkness, the fragile spheres bobbing upward like drunken fireflies, their strings trailing the mines toward the sub's last known position. But the wind shear caught them, twisting the formation into a snarl. One balloon snagged on the Vanguard's mast, yanking a mine loose prematurely. It detonated harmlessly in the foam, shaking the hull and flooding the lower decks with seawater. Elias had dived into the bilge himself, sealing a breach with whatever rags and prayers he could muster, while Harlan cursed in that clipped Yorkshire accent of his. "Bloody contrivance, I told you the lifter weight was off by a stone." Yet they'd adapted, cutting the damaged lines and redeploying the rest with handheld catapults, Harlan's quick sketches on a soggy notepad guiding the crew. Now, as the sonar operator's voice crackled over the intercom, "Contact bearing 090, depth 150, closing fast." Elias scanned the horizon. The storm had masked their approach, but the U-boat was surfacing for air, its diesels gasping after the prolonged dive. There, a sleek shadow breaching the waves, water cascading off its hull like a breaching whale. The balloons, what remained of them, drifted lazily above, invisible against the roiling clouds until a gust caught the strings. Elias's heart hammered. "All hands, battle stations, torpedo crews, stand by." Harlan burst onto the bridge, soaked to the bone, his engineer's cap askew. "She's got a gash from our earlier charges. Leaking oil, sir. But if they spot those balloons—" He trailed off, eyes narrowing at the periscope sweep cutting the water. The Germans would laugh if they saw it first. A paper armada, born of desperation in a Liverpool workshop, meant to mimic Allied aircraft silhouettes from afar, drawing the sub into mine range. Moral ambiguity gnawed at Elias. Was this ingenuity, or just prolonging the inevitable? Men like the kraut captain below were sailors too, trapped in the same grind. Jensen fired the first signal flare, its red arc piercing the gloom. The balloons caught the light, their paper skins translucent, mines dangling like deadly fruit. The U-boat's deck gun swiveled, a puff of smoke betraying the shot. It whistled wide, slamming into the waves astern. "Evasive!" Elias shouted, the destroyer heeling hard to port. Harlan grabbed the voice tube. "Full ahead, both screws. Give 'em hell." The Vanguard surged, guns blazing in staccato bursts, shells stitching the sea around the sub. Then it happened. A balloon line tangled in the U-boat's periscope, yanking it taut. The mine cluster swung low, magnets locking onto the hull with a metallic thud that echoed even over the thunder. The sub's crew erupted on deck, frantic figures in oilskins, but too late. The detonation ripped through the pressure hull, a muffled boom rising to a roar, steel buckling like tin foil. The U-boat listed, bow high, then plunged stern first into the abyss, bubbles and debris marking its grave. Elias lowered the binoculars, the acrid tang of cordite mixing with rain. Silence fell, broken only by the creak of the ship and Jensen's exhale. "We did it, sir. With paper." Harlan slumped against the bulkhead, wiping grime from his face. "Aye, but at what cost? Lost 2 in the flooding below. Good men." His voice cracked, the wit drained away. Elias felt it too, the weight settling like the storm's aftermath. They'd sunk the sub, saved the Convoy trailing miles behind, but the Vanguard limped now, her pumps whining against the breach. No triumphant cheers, just the grim tally of survival. As dawn broke gray and unforgiving, Elias lit a cigarette, sharing it with Harlan. The war ground on, demanding more from them. Courage laced with doubt, victories hollowed by loss. The paper balloons, drifting remnants caught in the wind, whispered of fragile hopes adrift on endless seas.